Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Mississippi Delta to a small town called Belzoni, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of pine and the weight of history. Imagine the night of May 7th, 1955. The sun has long since vanished, leaving behind a sky of deep indigo, speckled with stars that shimmer with a quiet, distant indifference. It is the Saturday before Mother's Day, a time for quiet preparation. But in the heart of Humphreys County, the stillness carries a different frequency. The atmosphere is thick with humidity and a tension that has been simmering for decades. Belzoni was known as the catfish capital, but to some, it bore a more sinister name, Bloody Belzoni. It was a place of stark contrasts, where the bright white of the cotton fields met the dark, fertile soil. On this night, the town was transitioning from the day's bustle to the hush of midnight. The wooden storefronts along the main street stood like silent sentinels, their windows reflecting the pale moonlight. There is a specific kind of silence in the rural South, a layering of sounds that emphasizes the lack of human noise. You can hear the rhythmic pulsing of the cicadas, a vibrating drone that feels like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Moving through this landscape was Reverend George Washington Lee. He was a pillar of the community, a man of faith and a man of business. He owned a small grocery store and a printing press, tools he used to serve the spiritual and practical needs of his neighbors. But George Lee was also a pioneer. He was the first Black man to register to vote in Humphreys County since Reconstruction, a feat that in 1955 was revolutionary. He didn't just want the vote for himself. He wanted it for every person. Along with Gus Courts, he had spent hours urging others to pay poll taxes and sign the registration rolls. Earlier that day, George had been at his store. His wife, Rosebud, was home, resting. The day had been punctuated by strange visits, men delivering warnings. They wanted him to take his name off the voting rolls and stop his work. But Reverend Lee had already decided that some things were worth the price. He had received a threatening note only days before, yet he remained undeterred. As the evening wore on, he closed the store and ran one last errand. He needed to pick up a suit from the dry cleaners. He climbed into his 1954 Buick, the engine turning over with a familiar and reassuring growl. The drive was short. The Buick's headlights cut bright paths through the gathering mist. Inside, the air smelled of old leather and printing ink. George was a careful driver, his hands steady. As he navigated the turns, the world was a blur of dark foliage and the occasional porch light. The rhythm was hypnotic, the soft thrum of tires, the gentle swaying of the car as it rounded a curve. It was a moment of solitude, the only one he had found in a long day filled with leadership and the shadow of threats. But the peace was a fragile illusion. Behind him, another set of headlights appeared, closing the gap with predatory intent. It was a convertible. As George neared Church Street, the other vehicle pulled alongside. The silence was violently shattered. 3 shotgun blasts erupted, the roar drowning out the insects and the car's engine. The lead pellets tore through metal and glass, striking George in the face and neck with force. His jaw was shattered. The Buick veered wildly, leaving the road and crashing into a small frame house. In the aftermath, a heavy stillness returned. Smoke from the shotgun fire curled into the humid air, and the acrid smell of burnt rubber replaced the scent of night flowers. Reverend Lee, wounded but clinging to life, pulled himself from the wreckage. He made his way toward a nearby cab stand, a final testament to his will. 2 men found him and rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was too great. Before midnight, his voice was silenced. The sheriff would later claim the pellets were merely dental fillings loosened by the crash, a cruel lie that would ring as loudly as the shots. The midnight bell had tolled for George Lee, and as we shall see, the town of Belzoni would never be the same again. The shadows had claimed a hero, but the light he sparked was far from being extinguished. Let the smoke of that spring night drift away for a moment. To truly understand the shot that rang out on Church Street, we must first understand the man who held the wheel of that Buick. George Washington Lee was a man shaped by the unique, heavy soil of the Mississippi Delta. He was born on Christmas Day in 1903 in the small town of Edwards. He was a child of the hard earth, raised in the shadow of a plantation by a mother who knew only back-breaking labor in the fields. After she passed, George found himself in the care of an aunt, and from those early, lean years, a peculiar iron was forged in his spirit. While many around him were forced into the rhythm of the seasons, planting and picking until their backs curved like the very cotton rows they tended, George saw a different horizon. He was one of the few, a rarity in those times, who managed to graduate from high school, walking away from the fields and toward the printed word. His journey eventually took him south to the humid, bustling docks of New Orleans. Imagine the smell of ripening bananas, the salt air of the Gulf, and the brackish river water filling his lungs as he worked among the crates and the clatter of the port. It was there, amidst the heavy machinery of the city, that he learned the meticulous art of typesetting. He worked with his hands, yes, but his mind was focused on the mechanics of communication. Eventually, the pull of the Delta brought him back home, landing him in Belzoni, a town resting quietly on the banks of the Yazoo River. In the heart of the Great Depression, while the world seemed to be crumbling under economic weight, George heard a different call. He became a preacher, but not just for one congregation. He pastored 4 separate churches, his voice rising in small wooden sanctuaries where the air was always thick with the scent of pine resin and old hymnals. They called him the preaching printer, a man who could feed the soul from the pulpit and inform the mind through the press. But Reverend Lee was also a man of commerce, a savvy entrepreneur who believed that economic independence was the true foundation of freedom. Alongside his wife, Rosebud, he opened a grocery store that served as a hub for the local community. Imagine the sound of the bell as a neighbor walked in, the floorboards creaking underfoot, and the shelves lined with jars of preserves and heavy sacks of flour. In the back room of their home, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the printing press became a steady, industrial heartbeat. George would stand there for hours, his fingers stained with dark ink, carefully placing each lead letter into its frame. It was quiet, meticulous work, a physical manifestation of his belief that words had weight and permanence. This duality, the spiritual leader and the successful businessman, gave him a standing in Belzoni that few others could claim. He was not just a resident, he was a pillar that the community leaned upon. In the early 1950s, the heavy stillness of Belzoni began to ripple with the movements of a new era. George Lee looked at the world around him and saw the deep, systemic exclusion that kept his community in the shadows. Along with his friend Gus Quartz, another black grocer who shared his vision, he co-founded the Belzoni branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1953. They did not just meet in secret. They acted in the light. They used George's printing press to produce leaflets that spoke of a right long denied, the right to vote. In Humphreys County, where black residents outnumbered white residents by 2 to 1, the political power was held in a tight, exclusionary grip that had not been loosened since the end of Reconstruction. To challenge, this was to challenge the very structure of the Delta itself. Yet they began the work anyway, one registration form at a time. The moment George Washington Lee walked into the county courthouse to register his name, the air in Belzoni seemed to shift. He was the first black man in recent memory, perhaps the first since the 1900s began, to successfully place his name on the voting rolls of Humphreys County. It was a quiet act, a scratch of a pen on paper, yet it carried the thunder of a revolution. He and Gus Quartz did not stop with their own names. They worked tirelessly, moving through the dusty streets and the quiet parlors after sunset, encouraging others to pay their poll taxes and sign the registers. By 1955, they had helped nearly 100 people find their political voice. But as the list of names grew, so did the tension from the opposing side. The newly formed White Citizens Council began to watch. They circulated the names of those who registered, ensuring that credit was cut off at the banks and jobs were lost at the mills. The atmosphere was becoming suffocating. The pressure was relentless, but the Reverend was resolute. He was even offered a deal by white officials. They would provide him with protection, a shield against the rising hostility of the town, if only he would stop his registration efforts and remove his name. He refused without a moment of hesitation. In April of 1955, just weeks before the end, he stood before a crowd of 7,000 people in the all-black town of Mound Bayou. The humidity was heavy that evening, and the crowd was electric with a mixture of hope and fear. His voice, seasoned by years in the pulpit and the printing shop, cut through the night air. He famously told them, "Pray not for your mom and pop. They have gone to heaven. Pray you can make it through this hell." It was a declaration of faith, not just in the divine, but in the necessity of the struggle here on earth. He knew the danger, yet he returned to Belzoni anyway, a man of resolute faith, walking toward a destiny he had already accepted with an open heart. A sense of security, a guarantee of safety for his family and his business if he would only agree to one condition. He must stop his efforts to register black voters. Belzoni in the middle of the 1950s was a place of heavy air and long, stretching shadows. The humidity of the Mississippi Delta did not just sit on the skin. It seemed to press against the lungs, a physical weight that mirrored the social order of the time. The town was often called Bloody Belzoni by those who knew the sharp edges of its history, and in 1955, that edge was growing keener by the day. We left the Reverend George Lee at a crossroads of conscience. The white officials of Humphreys County had approached him with a proposition that hung in the air like the scent of swamp water, offering him a hollow peace in exchange for the silence of his community. But for George Lee, such a deal was a betrayal of his very soul. He knew that a peace bought with the disenfranchisement of his neighbors was no peace at all. The atmosphere in Belzoni was rapidly changing, fueled by the birth of the White Citizens Council in 1954. This organization sought to exert control through the slow, agonizing squeeze of economic pressure rather than the blunt instrument of the lynch mob. They were the refined version of resistance, composed of bankers and lawyers who wore suits instead of robes. They began to compile lists of names belonging to those who had dared to sign the voter registration books. These lists were weapons, used to ensure that anyone seeking a more equal future would find their present reality crumbling around them, one denied loan or canceled credit line at a time. Imagine the quiet tension in a small grocery store when credit is suddenly revoked with a cold, wordless look. Think of the sound of a telephone clicking as a bank manager informs a father that his mortgage is no longer in good standing. This was the reality for the 92 black citizens who had followed Reverend Lee and Gus Courts to the courthouse. One by one, these brave individuals were summoned by white employers or creditors. They were told that their names must be removed from the voting rolls if they wished to keep their jobs or their homes. Many were forced to capitulate, their survival tied to the very people who sought to keep them powerless. Yet, amidst this storm of intimidation, George Lee stood like a cypress tree in the Delta, deeply rooted, unmoving, and seemingly untouched by the fear that clouded the streets. The Reverend's refusal was a public defiance that resonated through the dusty streets of Belzoni. When Sheriff Ike Shelton refused to accept poll tax payments from black residents, Lee did the unthinkable. He took the matter to the courts. He intended to force the state to look at its own reflection in the mirror of the law. The pressure from the Citizens Council intensified as they realized Lee could not be bought. They did not just want him to stop. They wanted him to disappear from the social fabric. They watched him from parked cars as he walked to his grocery store. Every time Lee started his printing press in the back room of his home, the mechanical rhythm seemed to beat out a message of persistence that the town's elite found increasingly intolerable, a steady pulse of dissent that wouldn't be silenced. In the pulpit of his Baptist church, Lee's voice became a beacon for those still clinging to hope. He spoke of a hell on earth that they must navigate, a landscape of inequality that required more than just prayer. It required a collective action that began at the ballot box. He told his congregation to pray for their own courage, rather than for those who had already passed on to glory. The air in the sanctuary would grow thick with the heat of hundreds of bodies and the crackle of his words. Outside, the world of the 1950s continued its slow, grinding rotation, but inside that church, a new vision of Mississippi was being forged. It was a vision that the Council of White Citizens was determined to extinguish, using every tool of suppression at their disposal, from the ledger book to the darkness of the night. As April turned to May in 1955, the threats became tangible, delivered in the cold stares of men in passing cars and the heavy silence of the town square. Lee had been warned by friends and foes alike that he was living on borrowed time. 3 days before the end, a note arrived at his home, demanding once more that he drop his name from the rolls. He looked at the paper, then out at the Delta sunset, where the sky turned the color of bruised plums. He did not flinch. He continued to drive his Buick through the familiar streets, the engine a low hum in the quiet Mississippi night. The weight of the vote was heavy, but to George Lee, it was a weight worth carrying, no matter the cost that lay ahead in the thickening shadows of the Delta night. The Mississippi Delta in early May is a place of heavy, liquid heat. It is a time when the air begins to thicken with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, cloying perfume of honeysuckle. In the town of Belzoni, the year 1955 was unfolding with a weight that felt different from the years before. Reverend George Lee could feel it in the way the wind moved through the cypress trees, a restless, whispering breeze that did not bring relief, but rather carried the hushed murmurs of a town on edge. This was the Delta breeze, a constant companion that seemed to watch as much as it cooled. For George, the weeks leading up to that fateful May were marked by a silence that was far from peaceful. It was a silence filled with eyes. Everywhere he went, from his grocery store to the small room where he operated his printing press, the atmosphere was thick with the knowledge that he had crossed an invisible, dangerous line. He was a man who believed in the power of the vote, and in Belzoni, that belief was seen by some as a declaration of war. The intimidation often began with the telephone. In the quiet of the evening, when the sun had dipped below the horizon, the sharp, mechanical ring of the phone would slice through the air. Sometimes, when George or his wife, Rose Budd, answered, there would be nothing but the hollow, metallic sound of a distant line. Other times, the voices were low and jagged, filled with the kind of cold certainty that makes the blood run slow. They told him to take his name off the voter rolls. They told him that his efforts to register others were a sickness they intended to cure. One afternoon, a rock was hurled, a sudden and violent intrusion that shattered more than just glass. Attached to it was a note, scrawled with a message that called him and his peers by names meant to strip them of their humanity. It was a token, the paper said, a small taste of what was coming if he did not cease his work with the local branch of the NAACP. George would smooth out these notes with his large, steady hands, his face a mask of calm, even as the weight of the threat settled into the marrow of his bones. There is a specific kind of courage required to walk a path when you know you are being watched. George felt it every time he stepped into his car. In the rearview mirror, he would often see the same set of headlights, lingering a few car lengths back, never gaining, never turning away. It was a slow-burn surveillance, designed to fray the nerves and tighten the chest. He knew the makes of the cars, the old, heavy Fords and Chevrolets that belonged to the men of the White Citizens Council. These men did not always hide. Sometimes they would simply sit in their parked vehicles outside his home, the glowing cherries of their cigarettes the only light in the dark. They wanted him to know they were there. They wanted him to feel the reach of their influence, an influence that extended from the dirt roads to the very halls of the local courthouse. The pressure was not just physical, it was economic. Credit was squeezed, and the familiar faces of white businessmen he had known for years grew cold, their eyes turning downward whenever he passed them on the street. Even the authorities, the men sworn to uphold the law, became instruments of this growing shadow. Sheriff Ike Shelton was a man whose presence carried the full, heavy weight of the segregated South. There were moments when the pressure took the form of a deceptive kindness, a visit from men at the courthouse who offered George a deal. They told him that if he would simply stop his registration drives, if he would stop encouraging the black citizens of Humphreys County to claim their rightful place at the ballot box, he and his wife would be granted a special kind of protection. They would be allowed to vote in peace, provided no one else followed. It was a poison gift, a bribe wrapped in the guise of safety. George Lee, a man of God and a man of the people, looked them in the eye and refused. He understood that a right held only by the few is not a right at all, but a privilege granted by those in power. He told them he would rather die than tear up his poll tax receipt. His resolve was like the ancient oaks of the Delta, deep-rooted and unyielding, even as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Inside the walls of their home, the tension was a living thing. Rose Budley watched her husband with a mixture of immense pride and soul-deep terror. She saw the way he checked the locks on the doors, a new habit in a town where they had once felt secure. She heard the way his voice dropped when he spoke to his friend and colleague, Gus Courts, about the 92 new voters they had managed to register. It was a monumental achievement, a crack in the foundation of the old guard, and both men knew the cost of such progress. Rosebud would sometimes plead with him, her voice a soft, urgent whisper in the dark, asking him to lower his profile, to perhaps step back from the spotlight just for a little while until the heat died down. But George would take her hands in his and tell her that someone had to lead. He believed that the path to equality was paved with the struggles of this world, and he would not turn back now. Their house, once a sanctuary of laughter and community, had become a fortress of quiet prayer and hushed conversations, as they waited for the next ring of the bell or the next car to idle at the curb. In late April, George traveled to Mound Bayou to speak before a crowd of 7,000 people. The air there was electric, charged with the collective hope of thousands who had come to hear the leaders of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. When George stood at the pulpit, he did not speak of easy victories. He spoke of the reality of their lives. He told the crowd not to pray for those who had already passed on to heaven, for they were safe. Instead, he told them to pray that they could make it through the hell of the present. It was a speech that acknowledged the fire they were all walking through, a fire that was burning particularly hot for him back in Belzoni. As he drove home that night, the Delta breeze coming through the window, he must have known that the time of threats was transitioning into something far more dangerous. The anonymous calls and the lingering cars were the overture to a darker movement. Yet he continued to print his papers, he continued to lead his congregation, and he continued to carry the names of the registered voters like a sacred trust, a man of unwavering light in a landscape growing increasingly dim. As the calendar turned toward the 7th of May, the atmosphere in Belzoni reached a fever pitch. The threats were no longer just whispers, they were the very air the community breathed. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every passing car felt like a countdown. But George Lee did not falter. He walked with his head high, a pillar of strength for those who were too afraid to stand. He knew the danger was close as the sweat on his brow, yet he remained a steady force, a shepherd who refused to leave his flock even when the wolves were at the gate. The final weeks were a masterclass in quiet defiance, a period of time where a single man's courage stood as a tall, unbreakable barrier against the rising tide of hate. The Delta breeze continued to blow, carrying the scent of the river and the weight of history, as the shadows in Belzoni grew long and the night prepared to claim its due. We feel the clock ticking now, as the humid air of 1955 settles over the town, holding its breath for what comes next. May 7th, 1955, began with the heavy, stagnant humidity of the Mississippi Delta. In the small town of Belzoni, the air carried the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth, but beneath the sweetness was a metallic tang of dread. Reverend George Washington Lee spent the morning as he often did, tending to the grocery store he ran with his wife, Rosebud. The floorboards creaked under his steady steps as he moved between the aisles. It was a morning of quiet defiance. Lee was among the first black men in the county to register to vote, and he refused to be erased from the history of his home. Around mid-morning, 2 white men entered the shop. Their voices were low, their warnings sharp as broken glass. They told him to remove his name from the voter rolls and to stop his work. When they left, George looked at his wife and quietly told her they were just salesmen, but the shadow they left behind did not lift with the noon sun. The afternoon was a slow burn of heat and industry. George moved between his store and his printing press, the ink staining his fingers a deep, indelible black. The clicking of the metal type was the heartbeat of his resistance. Every newspaper he printed and every sermon he prepared was an act of faith in a future where his people were no longer disenfranchised by the local power structures. But Belzoni was watching him with a cold intensity. The eyes of the Citizens' Council were everywhere, in the windows of the banks and the mirrors of the storefronts. The threats were no longer mere whispers, they were atmospheric. 3 days earlier, he had received a letter that spoke of his end, but he kept it folded in his pocket, a secret weight. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, George prepared for his final tasks. He was a man of the cloth and a man of the word, and he had no intention of retreating. Evening fell like a heavy velvet curtain over Humphreys County. The chorus of cicadas rose from the cypress trees, a rhythmic, pulsing sound that filled the cooling air. George closed the doors of his grocery store for the final time. He had a suit to pick up from the dry cleaners, a suit he intended to wear to his pulpit the following morning. He climbed into his sturdy Buick, a car that had seen him through many miles of rural ministry and civil rights activism. The interior of the car smelled of old leather and the faint, sweet scent of the peppermints he often kept for the children of his congregation. As he turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, providing a mechanical reassurance in the darkening town. He began the drive home, his mind likely drifting toward the words of his next address. He was less than a block from his destination when the stillness of the night began to shift and the shadows behind him took a predatory form. The streetlights of the district cast long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. Behind him, a pair of headlights appeared, growing larger in his rearview mirror with a sudden, aggressive speed. It was a convertible, a pale ghost of a car that had been waiting in the obsidian shadows at the edge of the Negro section of town. George maintained his pace, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as the second vehicle closed the gap. The sound of its engine began to harmonize with his own, a high-pitched whine that signaled an unwelcome pursuit through the quiet streets. The road was empty, the houses tucked away behind porches and thick summer foliage. He was so close to home, so close to the safety of his own porch. But the white convertible was not merely passing him. It was a hunter closing in on its mark, its headlights blindingly bright, reflecting off his mirrors and illuminating the interior of his Buick with a harsh, artificial light. Then the night shattered. As the convertible pulled alongside him, the passenger side erupted in a series of orange flashes. 3 shotgun blasts tore through the humid air, the roar of the discharge echoing off the storefronts and residential houses. The heavy buckshot ripped through the metal of the Buick and shattered the glass of the driver's side window. One of the blasts struck George directly in the jaw, the force of the lead pellets tearing away his lower face and sending a spray of glass and blood across the dashboard. The impact was absolute and final. His car veered wildly, the tires screaming against the asphalt as it left the road. It careened into the night, jumping the curb and slamming with a sickening crunch into the porch of a nearby shotgun house. The convertible did not stop. It accelerated into the darkness, its taillights disappearing like two dying embers. George tried to stagger from the wreckage, his life spilling onto the dusty Mississippi soil. The aftermath was a grotesque theater of injustice. Neighbors rushed to the scene, finding the Reverend mutilated and gasping, and carried him to a hospital that would only confirm his passing. But the true horror was just beginning. Sheriff Ike Shelton arrived at the crash site, not as a seeker of truth, but as an architect of a cover-up. He stood over the Buick and the bloodied ground, and with a casual dismissiveness, he declared the murder a simple car accident. When confronted with the lead pellets extracted from George's jaw, Shelton made a claim that would live in infamy. He said the buckshot was nothing more than dental fillings that had been shaken loose by the force of the collision. He later tried to smear the Reverend's character, suggesting a crime of passion, but the town knew the truth. George W. Lee had been silenced by Lead, but as his widow Rosebud prepared for an open casket, she made sure the world would see the cost of the vote. A hospital, but the life was already slipping through their fingers like sand. The night in Belzoni was a heavy, suffocating blanket of Mississippi heat, the kind that clings to the skin and makes every breath feel like a labor. As the neighbors retreated into the shadows, their hearts hammering against their ribs, the silence that followed the Reverend's departure was broken by the low, guttural growl of a car engine. It was Sheriff Ike Shelton, the man who held the keys to justice in Humphreys County, arriving at the scene where the black Buick still sat crumpled against the side of a house. The headlights of the sheriff's vehicle cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust and the shards of glass on the dirt road. Shelton stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the gravel with a slow, rhythmic finality. He was a man of the old guard, a figure whose presence made the air grow colder, even in the middle of May. He did not rush to the wreckage. Instead, he moved with a casual, almost bored deliberation, his eyes scanning the scene not for evidence of a crime, but for a way to make the truth disappear into the humid night air. The sheriff approached the Buick, the driver's side door standing open like a wounded wing. The interior was a testament to the violence that had unfolded just minutes prior. The smell of burnt gunpowder, sharp and acrid, fought against the scent of spilled oil and the iron tang of blood that stained the upholstery. Shelton leaned in, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the yard. He looked at the steering wheel, at the shattered dashboard, and then at the ground where the Reverend had been found gasping for his final breaths. To any observer, the signs of an ambush were as clear as the stars in the Delta sky. There were the lead fragments, the holes in the tire, and the sheer force of the blast that had nearly decapitated the driver. But as Shelton stood there, his thumb hooked into his belt, a different narrative was already beginning to take shape in his mind. It was a narrative of convenience, one that would protect the status quo of a town built on the foundations of segregation and fear. He looked at the neighbors who remained, their faces pale in the moonlight, and he saw not witnesses, but obstacles to be managed. The physical state of Reverend George Lee was a sight that few who saw it would ever be able to scrub from their memories. The shotgun blasts had struck him with a devastating precision, tearing through the glass and into his face. An autopsy would later describe the damage in terms that defied the dignity of a man of God, noting that his jaw had been rendered into something that looked as though it had passed through a meat grinder. It was a brutal, intentional act of assassination, designed to silence a voice that had dared to speak of equality. When Shelton leaned down to inspect the area where the Reverend's head had rested, he saw the glint of metal, countless small, gray fragments of lead embedded in the torn flesh and the fabric of the seat. These were the remnants of the 3 shots fired from the passing convertible, the heavy buckshot that had ended a movement's momentum. Yet, as the sheriff stood back up, his expression remained unreadable, a mask of indifferent authority that refused to acknowledge the obvious reality of what had occurred on that lonely stretch of road. Then came the words that would define the depths of the injustice in Belzoni. With a dismissive wave of his hand, Sheriff Shelton turned to those gathered and declared that there was no need for a murder investigation. He looked at the carnage, at the lead pellets that were clearly the instruments of a crime, and he spoke a lie so audacious it seemed to hang in the air like a physical weight. He claimed that the Reverend had simply been involved in a tragic traffic accident. When questioned about the lead fragments found in the man's jaw and throat, Shelton's explanation was as creative as it was cruel. He insisted that the impact of the crash had been so severe that it had simply shaken the lead fillings loose from the Reverend's teeth. In the sheriff's version of reality, George Lee hadn't been hunted down on a dark road. He had merely been a poor driver whose dental work had turned into shrapnel upon impact. It was a statement that insulted the intelligence of the community and the memory of the man who lay dying, a calculated attempt to close the book on a killing before the investigation could even begin. The absurdity of the dental fillings theory was not lost on the people of Humphreys County, but the weight of the law was firmly behind it. Shelton was not just a disinterested observer. He was a man who had a personal and political history with Reverend Lee. Only 2 years earlier, in 1953, the Reverend and his friend Gus Courts had taken the sheriff to court because he refused to allow black citizens to pay their poll taxes. It was a direct challenge to Shelton's power, a strike at the heart of the system that kept the white minority in control of a majority black county. Shelton had been forced to testify before a federal grand jury, and though he hadn't been indicted, the humiliation and the threat to his way of life had lingered. To Shelton, George Lee was a troublemaker, a man who didn't know his place in the hierarchy of the Delta. By ruling the death and accident, the sheriff wasn't just being lazy. He was settling a score, ensuring that the man who had challenged him would be buried under a mountain of lies and forgotten by the official record. As the morning sun began to peek over the horizon on that Sunday in May of 1955, the local newspapers were already preparing their headlines. Negro leader dies in odd accident, the papers would read, echoing the sheriff's sentiment and spreading the fabrication to every corner of the state. The narrative was set: a car, a crash, and a freak occurrence of loose fillings. But the air in the black community of Belzoni was thick with a different truth. They knew the sound of a shotgun. They knew the color of a convertible that had been seen prowling the streets. And they knew the face of the man who had stood on a podium just weeks before, telling them to pray that they could make it through this hell. The sheriff's lie was a wall, tall and thick, built to block the path to justice. But it could not stop the grief from turning into a quiet, simmering resolve. The investigation was being smothered in its infancy, but the echoes of those 3 shots were still ringing, vibrating through the floorboards of every home in the Delta, waiting for someone to finally tell the story of what really happened on that dark night. The air in Belzoni that May of 1955 was heavy, a thick blanket of Mississippi heat that seemed to hold the town in a state of suspended animation. Within the walls of the Lee home, the silence was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, pressing down on Rosebud Lee. The grocery store was quiet, the printing press in the back room stood still, and the 4 churches where George had preached now waited for a voice that would never return. Rosebud, a woman of profound strength, now faced a solitude she had never invited. The shadows in the parlor grew long as the sun dipped below the horizon, and in that dimming light, a resolve began to take shape within her. It was a resolve born of a love that refused to be silenced by a shotgun blast on a lonely road. When they brought George to the mortuary, the devastation was impossible to ignore. The assassins had pulled alongside his car just before midnight, firing 3 rounds from a shotgun that found their mark with cruel precision. His lower jaw was not merely injured. It was shattered, a testament to the violence that sought to erase his voice from the voting rolls of Humphreys County. The doctors described a face that looked as though it had passed through a meat grinder. It was a sight that would haunt the dreams of any witness, a brutal deconstruction of a man who had spent his life building up his community. Yet, even in this state of ruin, George remained a figure of dignity. The metal fragments embedded in his flesh were the evidence of a hatred that could not bear the sight of a black man claiming his right to the ballot. While Rosebud grappled with this physical horror, the local authorities were weaving a different narrative. Sheriff Ike Shelton offered a story that defied logic. He claimed that George had simply been in a car accident. When confronted with the lead pellets extracted from George's face, the sheriff insisted they were nothing more than dental fillings, torn loose by the impact of the crash. It was a lie so transparent it felt like a second assault on the Lee family. The sheriff's words were a cold attempt to bury the murder alongside the man, to turn a targeted assassination into a mere statistical anomaly. But Rosebud was listening, and she knew that if the truth were to survive, it could not be hidden away. She would not allow George's sacrifice to be dismissed as a broken tooth and a steering wheel. The decision did not come easily. No widow wishes to display the remains of her beloved in such a broken state. Yet, as Rosebud looked at the man who had been the first to register to vote in their county, she realized that his body was now his final sermon. She understood that if they closed the lid of that casket, they would be closing the door on the reality of Mississippi's bloody Belzoni. She insisted that the casket remain open. She wanted the world to see what the shotgun had done. She wanted the neighbors, the press, and the politicians to look upon the shattered jaw of a minister who had only asked for the rights promised to every citizen. It was a sacrifice of private grief for public justice, turning her husband's remains into a mirror reflecting the soul of the state. On the day of the funeral, more than 1,000 people descended upon the small town. They came from the plantations and from cities far away, drawn by the news of a woman who refused to flinch. The heat was stifling as the line of mourners stretched down Church Street. Inside the sanctuary, the casket was placed at the front, its lid propped open. One by one, the people filed past. Some gasped, some wept, and others stood in a frozen, terrifying awe. The sight was recorded by photographers from the Chicago Defender and Jet magazine, capturing the raw, unedited cruelty of the act. These photographs would travel across the country, landing on kitchen tables and in the hands of activists like Medgar Evers, who saw in George's face the spark of a movement that could no longer be contained or denied. This act of defiance by Rosebud Lee was a precursor to a shift in the American consciousness. Only 3 months later, another mother in the same state would face a similar tragedy when her son, Emmett Till, was murdered. Mamie Till Mobley would later make the same decision to hold an open casket funeral, citing the need to let the world see what they did to her boy. The seeds of that global outcry were planted in Belzoni, in the resolve of a widow who refused to let a sheriff's lies about dental fillings obscure the reality of lead and buckshot. Rosebud's choice bridged the gap between private loss and a national awakening, ensuring that George W. Lee would not be forgotten as a victim of an accident, but remembered forever as a martyr for the vote. The air in Belzoni that May afternoon was thick, a heavy blanket of Mississippi humidity that clung to the skin and slowed the very passage of time. It was a stillness born of heat and shared breath, as a small town in the Delta found itself at the center of a national gaze. The dust on the unpaved roads sat undisturbed, yet there was a vibration in the atmosphere, a low hum of arrival. They came from the surrounding plantations, from the neighboring counties, and from the northern cities where the news had traveled fast. Every footfall on the dry earth seemed to echo with a heavy gravity. It was the day they would say goodbye to Reverend George Washington Lee, but the gathering was about more than a single life. It was a testament to a collective endurance that had reached its limit. As the hour of the service approached, the Green Grove Baptist Church became an island in a sea of mourners. The small wooden structure could not begin to hold the magnitude of the grief that had descended upon it. It was a modest building, smelling of old pine and beeswax, but its walls strained under the pressure of the moment. Because the interior was so limited, the gathering spilled out onto the church grounds and into the streets, transforming the quiet corner into a vast, outdoor cathedral. Over 2,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder in the unrelenting sun. The sight was unprecedented for the Delta. There were men in their best dark suits, their brows glistening with sweat, and women in white dresses clutching cardboard fans that moved in a rhythmic attempt to stir the stagnant air. Among the thousands were figures whose names would soon be etched into the history of a movement. Roy Wilkins, the leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had traveled from New York to stand on this dusty ground. Beside him were local giants like Dr. T.R.M. Howard and a young, determined Medgar Evers. Their presence signaled a shift in the wind. This was no longer just a local tragedy to be hushed up. It was a declaration against an era of silence. The national eyes of the organization were now fixed on Mississippi, and the weight of their attention felt like a physical force. The people in the crowd looked at these leaders and then at one another, finding a strange strength in their numbers. For a moment, the fear that governed life in the county was eclipsed by a massive, unified presence. But the most powerful statement made that day was not delivered in a speech. It was found within the casket itself. Rosebud Lee, the widow whose heart had been shattered just days prior, had made a decision that would ripple through the decades. Against every instinct of private mourning, she insisted that the casket remain open. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her husband in the dark of night. As the thousands filed past, they did not see a peaceful face at rest. They saw the devastating reality of the shotgun blast. His jaw, once used to preach the gospel of equality, was shattered and held together by the grim work of the mortician. The lead pellets that had torn through his flesh were visible reminders of a cruelty that could not be explained away. The sheriff had tried to claim that those lead pellets were merely dental fillings, loosened by a car accident, but no one in that vast assembly believed the lie. As the mourners looked upon the reverend, the absurdity of the official story hung in the air like a foul scent. The smell of lilies and roses, wilting in the heat, mixed with the metallic tang of the Delta soil. The sound of fans clicking in unison created a low, mechanical heartbeat for the service. Every now and then, a sob would break through the silence, sharp and sudden, before being folded back into the collective quiet. They were witnesses to a crime that the state refused to acknowledge, and in their seeing, they were performing an act of profound resistance that would soon inspire a nation to act. When the voices rose in song, the sound traveled far beyond the church property, carrying over the fields and into the homes of those who stayed away out of fear. The hymns were slow, the notes stretching out like long shadows. The eulogies spoke of a man who was a successful businessman and a devoted pastor, but they also spoke of a martyr who had given his life for the simple right to vote. As the service concluded and the procession began its march toward the cemetery, the realization took hold that something had fundamentally changed. The 2,000 mourners moved as one, a slow-moving river of grief and resolve. They left the church behind, but they carried the image of the Reverend's face with them. This day in Belzoni was a seed planted in the dark soil of the South. The silence that followed those songs was not just a lack of sound. It was a wall of intent. In the immediate aftermath of that night in 1955, the machinery of Humphreys County law began to turn, but its gears were not set to grind toward the truth. Instead, they moved to bury it under the red clay of the Mississippi Delta. Sheriff Ike Shelton, a man whose authority was as thick as the humid evening air, surveyed the scene on Church Street and saw not a murder, but a convenience. He looked at the shattered glass, the car resting against a house, and the broken body of a leader, and he chose to see an accident. There is a specific kind of chill that comes when the person sworn to protect the law becomes the first and most formidable barrier to it. The explanation offered by the sheriff's office remains a chillingly absurd footnote in the history of the struggle for civil rights. Despite the fact that multiple black physicians examined the body and found lead pellets embedded in the Reverend's face and neck, Shelton maintained a different narrative. He claimed the impact of the car crash had been so violent that it had simply shaken the lead fillings loose from Lee's own teeth, and these fillings had somehow migrated through his flesh to mimic the appearance of buckshot. It was a lie so transparent it was almost a dare. To believe it was to accept the rules of a game where the truth had no currency. The local press echoed these claims, trying to turn a targeted assassination into a simple tragedy of the road. When the call for a grand jury came in September of 1955, it was not a gathering of peers, but a fortress of the status quo. In that era, the jury boxes of Mississippi were strictly reserved for white men, many of whom were members of the White Citizens Council. The evidence that should have screamed, the threatening notes Lee had received, the eyewitness accounts of a convertible trailing his vehicle, the ballistics that clearly showed a shotgun blast, was treated as mere static. The local prosecutors showed little appetite for a fight that would disrupt the social order of Belzoni. Witnesses who had seen the car or heard the distinct cracks of the gun found themselves struck with a deep, protective silence. In a town where your boss and your landlord were often the same people, testifying was a risk few could afford. The cry for justice eventually reached the federal government. Attorney General Herbert Brownell Jr. ordered the Federal Bureau of Investigation to step in. Agents arrived in the Delta, their suits and accents marking them as outsiders in a landscape that did not welcome their questions. They spent months conducting interviews and forensic tests, eventually identifying two men, Marion Edward Ray, known as Peck, and Joe David Watson Sr., as the primary suspects. Both were members of the White Citizens Council, but the agents hit a wall that was both cultural and legal. At that time, the federal government had remarkably little power to prosecute a local murder, even if the motive was clearly tied to the denial of civil rights. This limitation left the investigation stalled at the edge of the county line. The legal era of the mid-1950s was a time of frustration. Without a robust Civil Rights Act, the Department of Justice was often a spectator to the violence. They could investigate and document, but unless they could prove a specific violation of the few federal laws that applied to voting interference, their hands were tied. In the case of Reverend Lee, the Bureau found themselves in a stalemate. They had the names and the motive, but they did not have the cooperation of a local system that was determined to protect its own. The suspects remained free, walking the same streets where they had once hunted their victim, a constant reminder to the community that some lives could be taken without any real consequence. This lack of accountability was a weapon of terror. This state of justice, denied, acted as a suffocating blanket over the county. The refusal to indict anyone for the killing of a prominent minister and businessman sent a clear message to every person who had ever considered standing in a line to register to vote. It whispered that the law stopped at the edge of the town, and that the federal government was a distant, helpless giant. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into the death of George Washington Lee began to lose its momentum, buried under the weight of more violence and the rising tide of a movement that was only just beginning to find its voice. The case was never truly closed by the spirit of the law, only by the silence of the powerful. It remains a haunting chapter in a book of secrets that the Delta still keeps. The refusal to indict anyone for the killing of a prominent minister and entrepreneur did not merely end a life. It ignited a fire that the Delta's humidity could not dampen. While the official record in Humphreys County remained frozen in a lie, the community refused to let the silence settle. Reverend George Washington Lee was a man of high standing, a businessman who owned a grocery store and a printing press, and a leader who believed that the ballot was the only true shield against the darkness of Jim Crow. When he was taken from his people on that humid night of May 7th, 1955, the killers likely thought they were burying a problem. Instead, they were planting a seed. The local authorities tried to call it a simple accident, but the people of Belzoni knew the sound of a shotgun better than they knew the sound of a tire blowing out. They knew the difference between a steering wheel injury and the jagged work of lead pellets fired at point-blank range. As the news of the investigation's failure rippled outward, the local grief transformed into a quiet, simmering resolve that would eventually boil over across the entire nation. The funeral for Reverend Lee was held in a church that could barely contain the heavy hearts of the 1,000 mourners who arrived from every corner of the state. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of pine and the sound of low, mourning spirituals, but inside, a decision was made that would change the course of history. His widow, Rosebud Lee, stood by his side with a strength that defied the crushing weight of her sorrow. She looked upon her husband, whose face had been shattered by 3 shotgun blasts, and she made a choice that was both radical and heartbreaking. She would leave the casket open. She wanted the world to see what the sheriff had tried to call a car accident. She wanted the congregants to see the reality of the price paid for a single signature on a voter registration roll. It was a visual testimony, a silent scream that preceded the world-famous decision by Mamie Till Mobley by exactly 4 months. The people filed past, their eyes fixed on the evidence of a man who had been murdered for the simple, radical act of believing he was a citizen. But the story did not stay confined within the wooden pews of that Mississippi church. The image of George Lee's broken face began to travel. It was captured by photographers from major black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and highlighted in the pages of Jet magazine. In the mid-50s, Jet was more than a publication. It was the nervous system of Black America. When those glossy pages arrived in homes from Harlem to Los Angeles, the face of the prophet of Belzoni stared back at them, undeniable and visceral. People held the magazine in their hands, their thumbs brushing against the ink that detailed the sheriff's ridiculous claim that the lead in Lee's jaw was nothing more than dental fillings. The absurdity of the lie added a sharp edge to the tragedy. It made the injustice feel personal even to those who had never stepped foot in the Delta. This was the moment the movement began to find its voice, moving away from quiet requests for decency and toward a demand for the fundamental right to exist without being hunted for exercising the law. In the shadows of this growing outrage, a young man named Medgar Evers was watching, learning, and documenting. As the field secretary for the NAACP, Evers was one of the first to arrive in Belzoni to investigate the crime that the state refused to acknowledge. He spent long hours in the humid night, meeting with witnesses in the back of grocery stores and in the safety of dimly lit kitchens. It is often said that Evers truly cut his teeth on the Lee case. He learned how to navigate the treacherous waters of Mississippi justice, how to feed information to the national press to keep a story from dying, and how to look directly into the eyes of a system that wanted him gone. He saw the 92 names that Reverend Lee had helped register to vote in 1953, and he understood the immense power those names held. To the white citizens' councils, those names were a threat to their way of life. To Medgar, they were the blueprint for a new world. He carried the memory of George Lee's sacrifice with him as he traveled the dusty backroads, his resolve hardening with every mile. The legacy of Reverend Lee was also tied to the words he spoke just 1 month before his death. In April, at a massive meeting of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership in Mound Bayou, he stood before a crowd of 7,000 people. The air that day was electric, charged with the energy of a people who were tired of living in the margins. Lee's voice had boomed across the fields, telling the crowd to pray not for their parents who had already gone to heaven, but to pray that they could make it through the hell they were living in right then. He urged them to stand their ground, to pay their poll taxes, and to keep their names on the rolls even when the bank threatened their loans or the sheriff threatened their lives. When he was killed so soon after this speech, he became a martyr in the truest sense of the word. His death was not an end, but an exclamation point on every word he had preached from the pulpit. The activists across the South recognized that the fear tactics used in Belzoni were a sign of desperation from a crumbling regime. As we look back at the ripple effect of this tragedy, we see how the murder of George Lee served as the catalyst for the giants who followed. It informed the work of the NAACP throughout the 1950s and set the stage for the voting rights battles that would peak a decade later in 1965. The injustice in Humphreys County was a sharp reminder that the law was only as good as the men who enforced it. And when those men were the ones pulling the triggers, the people had to look toward a higher justice. The movement was stirring, no longer a collection of isolated incidents, but a cohesive, growing force of resistance. The blood shed on the road to Midnight, Mississippi, was the ink that wrote the first chapters of a new era. The shadows were still long, and the danger was far from over. But the light that Reverend Lee had struck in the darkness was now a flame that could not be extinguished. In every footfall of every march that would come, the echo of his defiance remained, a steady drumbeat underneath the long walk toward the ballot box. The air in the Mississippi Delta does not move. It sits. It is a heavy, velvet blanket that smells of damp earth and the ancient, slow-moving waters of the Yazoo River. In the town of Belzoni, the nights have a way of stretching out, turning the shadows into something thick and tangible. When we look back at the life and the sudden, violent end of George Washington Lee, we are not just looking at a date on a calendar. We are looking at the very soil of Humphreys County, a ground that has been turned over and over again, yet still holds the deep, metallic echoes of 1955. To understand the legacy of the man they called the Reverend, you have to imagine the absolute stillness of a midnight drive on Church Street, and the sudden, shattering sound of 3 shotgun blasts that changed the course of American history forever. He was a man of business and a man of the cloth, but most importantly, he was a man of conviction who believed that the simple act of casting a ballot was a sacred right that no shadow could extinguish. The tragedy of George Lee is not only found in the violence of his death, but in the calculated silence that followed. We must sit with the absurdity of the official record from those days. Sheriff Ike Shelton, a man whose name is now etched in the ledger of injustice, looked at the lead pellets pulled from the Reverend's shattered jaw and claimed they were nothing more than dental fillings. He suggested that the impact of a car crash had simply shaken the metal loose from the man's teeth. It was a lie so thin, so fragile, that it was insulting to the very idea of truth. Yet for decades, that lie was the official narrative, resting in the dusty files of the courthouse like a stone in a garden. The power of the Delta's white power structure at that time was absolute, and they intended for the case of George Lee to be swallowed by the mud and the rising heat of the summer. They wanted the world to believe that a leader of the people had simply suffered a tragic accident on a lonely road. But the truth has a way of breathing, even when it is buried deep. George Lee's widow, Rosebud, made a choice that would ripple through the decades. She refused to let the lie stand. She opened her husband's casket so that the world could see the reality of what 3 lead pellets had done to a man who only wanted to vote. This visual testimony was a seed. It was the same seed that would later inspire Mamie Till Mobley when her son, Emmett, was murdered just a few months later in a neighboring county. The legacy of George Lee is woven into the very fabric of the civil rights movement, serving as the quiet, agonizing precursor to the giants who would follow. He was the first Black man in memory to register to vote in Humphreys County since the era of Reconstruction, and he refused to take his name off that list, even when the threats came in the mail, even when the night grew cold with the promise of violence. Decades passed, and the sun rose and set over Belzoni thousands of times before the federal government turned its eyes back toward the Delta. In the year 2008, as part of a cold case initiative, the Federal Bureau of Investigation reopened the file. They tracked down the names that had been whispered in the shadows for over half a century: Marion Edward Ray and Joe David Watson. They looked for the convertible that had pulled alongside the Reverend's car. They looked for witnesses who had long since moved away or passed into the earth themselves. In July of 2011, the Department of Justice finally closed the book. They acknowledged that there was evidence pointing toward those men. But with the suspects dead and the statute of limitations long since expired, there would be no trial, no gavel, and no formal sentence. The case remained, in the eyes of the law, unsolved. It is a weight that the town still carries, a story that remains unfinished in the hearts of those who remember. Today, when you walk through the streets of Belzoni, the humidity is still the same. The crickets still sing their rhythmic, hypnotic song in the tall grass near the riverbanks. There is a marker now, a sign of remembrance that stands as a quiet sentinel where George Lee once lived and worked. His conviction was not just about a single election. It was about the enduring power of dignity over fear. Though no man ever stood in a courtroom to answer for that night in May, the legacy of the Reverend is found in every hand that reaches for a ballot today. The soil of the Delta holds his story, and though the details may feel heavy, they are now part of the peace of the past. The turbulence of 1955 has settled into the long, low mist that rolls over the cotton fields at dawn. We can look at this history now from a place of safety, acknowledging the struggle while letting the tension leave our own bodies. As we reach the end of this journey, the weight of the investigation begins to lift. The names of the sheriffs and the suspects fade into the gray fog of history, leaving behind only the steady, quiet light of a man who stood his ground. You can feel the rhythm of your own breath now, steady and calm, contrasting with the stories of old. The world outside is quiet. The shadows in your room are soft and familiar, offering a sanctuary from the complexities of the world. There is nothing left to solve, and there are no more questions to answer. The legacy of George Washington Lee is secure, and your work for today is done. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.